So do you guys want to introduce yourselves and say how do you think you have or haven't disrupted people?
Sure, I'll start. I'm Sam E. I'm a product designer at Spotify. Work on the monetization, but definitely help out with other parts of Spotify like radio and social. And I think Spotify has disrupted market maybe in two places. I think it disrupted the way people are consuming music, and maybe also the way music labels and artists are now making music through digital streaming.
Hey everyone, my name is Scott Silverman. I'm a product designer also at Uber, and I previously, before Uber, I've been at Uber for about 6 months. Prior to that, I was at Airbnb for a few years. So I think the ways. Sorry, technical difficulties here. The ways that Uber has disrupted are, fair. I guess some of them are fairly obvious in that we are working on disrupting the way that people move around cities. Primarily, just right now, it's focused on transportation. So how do you get quickly from point A to point B? One of the ways I like to think about Uber is it's my sort of, until we actually have a teleport, this is my sort of modern version of a present-day teleport. It's my personally, it's my fallback for when I need to get somewhere really quickly. It's a replacement for me for a taxi cab. And some of the things that we've kind of improved upon in the traditional taxi experience is primarily around access, around cost, and around speed and experience. So we've provided a faster, potentially safer, a better, a more efficient, and I think more enjoyable way to get from one place to another. And we've done that in, I think we're close to 260 cities around the world now.
Hi, I'm Chloe Sladden. About almost 6 years ago, I founded Twitter's media team. The media team was responsible for the highest quality content across television, news, music, politics, a whole range of different areas of media. And I'd say the way Twitter disrupted, Kristen mentioned some of them, but in media in particular, it became a wholly new way to find and discover media. So it became a new kind of front page for news. It became a new kind of TV guide for how to find what TV shows were popular or interesting. So it really changed how users found content they cared about, and then it changed the nature of that relationship. So TV's traditionally been a one-way medium, and it really became, amongst many other things, a two-way and interactive TV platform, a way to have a relationship with journalists and with breaking news, a way to get to know celebrities and politicians better. So that latter piece too, other than finding media, Twitter also really changed the way people connected with celebrities or other high-profile users. It shifted during elections how they discovered politicians and what they stood for and how they connected with them. And in that, it disrupted a whole range in the value chain of the PR field and how celebrities connected with their fans in the past, how fans understood and connected with their celebrities, and how news was disseminated from those high-profile people.
Cool. So for you, you talked about who you disrupted, but how did Spotify do it?
Initially, when Spotify first started, I think back in 2005 or 2006, the music market in Stockholm, where they originally started from, was a lost market. It was considered a lost market. So music labels weren't making any money, mainly because piracy was so dominant, especially for downloads of music and albums. And so what the founders of Spotify did was they went to the labels and said, listen, this is a lost market. We really can't do anything. I mean, people are just pirating. Give us your inventory in terms of like music and all your albums, and we're going to try and figure something out. And so essentially, the founders of Spotify went into a partnership with the music labels. They gave them all their content and launched Spotify, which is a streaming service. I think the main point was that it's a lot more difficult to download something by trying to find the torrents and like downloading the albums. Instead, you can have like this amazing one-click access into like all the music that you can find in a legal way that makes people feel good.
So would you say it's a business model innovation or a user innovation?
I think it's a mix of both. I think in terms of business model, it was definitely a way for the music labels to actually start making money in those markets again. But in terms of like a behavioral, it's something that really wasn't done that well until that point, where you had this huge library of music that one click and you can just start playing this random song that you used to like 10 years ago.
What's your favorite Spotify song?
Oh,
Or
wow.
song in general. I guess.
Mm.
This is embarrassing, but probably Borderline by Madonna.
I wouldn't have guessed that one.
It's a great track.
Do we have that? Can someone start playing that? Okay, from the Twitter perspective, I think that it's an interesting question of how you guys disrupted and how you think about business model versus customer disruption.
Yeah, well, I think, Twitter's disruption from the media standpoint, we took a very different stance, a very unpopular stance at the time. So 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the media industry in New York and LA generally saw Silicon Valley as disruptive in a very negative sense, in a sense that they were not going to be partnered with, that they were thought of as an industry that couldn't evolve, wasn't really relevant anymore. And so there was a lot of anxiety and anger, I would say, towards Silicon Valley. And when we went out to talk to our partners, we took a position of saying, you know what, we want to be a complement to traditional media. And that was like such a salve to them. It's such an interesting, different position. Now it's not as uncommon. In fact, many Valley companies are sort of trying to find that path. But it was really unusual at the time. And there were sort of two reasons for doing it. One was, the most important was that Twitter's own growth trajectory was so tied to traditional media. We saw that only once we were able to actually measure tweets, which when I started, we had no way of knowing how many tweets per minute were happening. We couldn't like measure them. We didn't have a taxonomy to be able to say, okay, how many about the Super Bowl right now, or how many about this breaking news story? It was just something we would get on search and put in words and see how fast the tweets would come down and kind of guess. But eventually, we actually got a system in place where we could say, okay, for this set of keywords, what is the actual graph of attention on Twitter? And it became very clear that events in the real world were happening on Twitter, that Twitter was becoming a heartbeat of these real-life events. And the most powerful place to find those events is in traditional media. And so it became clear that Twitter's own growth was going to be tied to a great extent by how well we could integrate and add those two forces together, what you were watching on television, what you were starting to read about in the news, and find a way to really bring those two together in a way that would explode the growth for both. So that was where we started, which was, look, we're going to try and innovate. We want to create interactive television. We want to create a new kind of news. There's a new form of breaking news that's happening on Twitter. You guys are the journalists, the producers. You own this audience, but the audience is using Twitter to connect, to interact, and to find your content. So please join us. Let's find ways to make your shows more interactive, to make your news faster or more accurate or more meaningful or with richer sources. And it was something that they were, not all of them were receptive to at all. And so there's we can talk later a little bit about the tactics of how you create disruption within traditional media or within big existing systems. There's a lot of interesting ways you can play people off one another and create tension and competition that's critical to creating that disruption. But overall, the story of saying we're here to build your business with you. We want to actually drive larger audiences to you. We want that audience to be more valuable. That was how we decided to approach disruption. I philosophically believe that when you can, and you can't always do that, when you can, that is a much faster path to growth and to evolution than not. But it takes a lot more. You have to believe in your partners, and you have to put a fair bit of work into really coming at the problem from their point of view. So one, it was sort of a philosophical preference of mine, and then two, which was critical, it aligned so deeply with how Twitter was actually naturally growing at the time.
Nice. So that seems so we're taking a partner strategy there, and it seems a little bit differently, at least from how Uber currently is working, which is, at least to the outside world, saying it's not a partner strategy.
Sure, yeah. I mean, so the idea for Uber was born back in 2009 when so Travis and Garrett actually it came out of frustration with getting a cab in San Francisco. They both lived in San Francisco. They were at the Le Web conference in Paris, and they were kind of jamming on a bunch of ideas, and were very frustrated with just kind of like, and I'm sure many of you have probably had experiences trying to hail a cab, 5 years ago in San Francisco. It's ugly. It's like half the time they won't take your credit card. They won't take you out to the Richmond or to the Outer Sunset if you happen to live out there. And there's just an undersupply. And so that was sort of a key frustration, and it actually started primarily as a luxury service. And so Uber first started providing black car service, and the way that it first started was Garrett and Travis actually shared a Mercedes, I think it was like a black S-Class, and they hired a driver, and they would actually, I think it was like texting each other and figuring out like when they could share this driver. The idea was like a shared personal professional driver. They went and they kind of piloted that service in New York City, And then in the middle of 2010, they launched the Uber, a very similar version of what we know of Uber today here in San Francisco. And so that was about, 4.5 years ago at this point. And sort of the next thing that was launched was in several cities in America and then a few cities in Europe was that black car service. And the black car service is actually, it's a bit of a partner model in a certain way in that Uber actually works with transportation companies, transportation providers, limo companies, things like that to hail those riders directly to where you are based on your smartphone's location. It wasn't until I think it was the middle of 2012 when UberX was launched, which was more of the, you could say, they're both disruptive, but you could say in a certain way it was the more disruptive of the two in that it increased access by bringing down cost. And that was the thing, that's the thing that I use, not every day, but certainly a couple of times a week to get around the city. And there still is that element of partnership. We actually don't refer to drivers as drivers. We actually refer them to as partners. We think of them as sort of like entrepreneurs in and of themselves, and that like we are partnering, we are the platform by which they are able to partner and provide this service to the riders.
Interesting. So a different kind of thinking of the partner being the driver versus the actual company that you're disrupting. Although in the beginning it was the limos that you were partnering with.
Yes. So that was the first, and that still exists today. If you use the black car service, a fair number of those partners are still through the limo companies. Yeah.
Cool. So Sam, you're a user designer. So what do you think about this idea of the Clay Christensen model of disruption versus this kind of incrementalism style of innovation?
So like the incremental style was something that I think we always try to strive for in terms of like, especially when you're designing a new product or a new feature. I think it makes a lot more sense, especially when you're trying to get something out that no one has used before. I think there is something that people like to see, especially when it's a new feature, a new product, a sense of familiarity. Sorry, can't say that fast. And the way
Play Madonna, or is it?
And there's a sense that, if you make these incremental changes, it's a lot easier for users to understand. But when you're finally done with sort of like your first phase of incremental changes, the difference is very vast, right? So much like the flop, it might have been incremental for him, but by the time it was the Olympics, no one had seen that before, and it's a drastic change. So I think those are the things that we try to strive for, and I think the incremental changes definitely align with more of what we try to do at Spotify.
Interesting. What about you guys? Thoughts on?
Well, I mean,
incremental
when you look
versus-
at what Ev had created before, you have Blogger, Twitter, Medium. Like, there's a theme there in how I think he thinks about content and creating content. So I think for him, perhaps there's sort of this interesting arc. I think it's sort of it can be sometimes a blend of there's a set of product features that come together that are amazing at the time, but then it's an iterative process for actually getting that to scale or getting it to a significant set of folks. I tend to believe more in the iterative process, or it's these combinations of things that release whole new value. It's not necessarily, it feels wholly new, but it may actually be an evolution of a whole set of problems we've been trying to solve for decades.
Yeah, I think it's a similar sort of answer, not to kind of join the chorus, but in that if you think about the very first version of Uber, depending on when you want to start counting, it was actually just a car with a phone and kind of calling through text message or a phone call, and then it wasn't until the app was sort of launched. So it depends on sort of where you draw that line. Like, what was the moment that the first flop was taken over that bar, and that's sort of the moment that the world discovered that this guy Fosbury had discovered this kind of new way of jumping over a bar. Similar kind of story with I think these three examples here up on the stage. But I don't know. I sort of tend to think that I certainly identify more strongly. Oh, cookies fell. I identify personally, I guess, and a little bit more with the Clay Christensen model of thinking, and that I think disruption tends to come most clearly from outside and suddenly, and I think having the best way to find that source of innovation and disruption is to kind of carve off some special little space on the outside and sort of start in a certain way from scratch. I think it's a cleaner way for me personally to think. helps me approach the problem.
So are your companies doing anything to prevent yourselves from getting disrupted now that you're kind of the giant in the industry?
You want to go first?
I left Twitter a few months ago, so I'm not certain what they're doing right now. But I would say, once we had established this sort of primacy in the field, of course, the competition became extraordinarily fierce, and we'd be at the Golden Globes, the Oscars, and Instagram, Facebook, you name it, Snapchat. Everyone is there trying to create a similar connection and not just content discovery model, but also participation model. So absolutely, I mean, I think. The number one focus, and this is true for any company, when you worry about disruptions, you've just got to focus on your product and making that product evolve as well as it possibly can. The more you get distracted by looking around you, the more you lose that sense of what you are and what your true value is and where your users are going. So that's always been, and I think it still is, Twitter's main focus is how to evolve the product effectively.
Yeah, and I think there's a sense of the community readiness is in terms of like what new features we feel people are certainly ready for. Because I mean, if I think about it, like I've used a service like Spotify previous to Spotify being super popular. In fact, there's a service called Rhapsody, which I was actually a big fan of, but for some reason, it never really took off until Spotify came out, and it might have been just like these little changes that made it better. But ever since that, I mean, I think as a company, we sort of think about, in the same view as yours, we really can't be looking around in terms of thinking of what other people are doing. And we really just try to focus on what we feel are going to be the main points that people are going to come back to Spotify for in terms of, adding value to their life with music, and think about those use cases and constantly iterating on them.
Nice. Anything about timing? So you brought up a good point of like this, like it was right time, right place for you guys, and maybe there's small details, maybe it's timing.
Right. Certainly, like the example that I talked about in Sweden, it was definitely all about timing at that point. It was certainly a need. The music companies were not making any money, right? And so it was a need that the people needed. It was a need that the companies needed. So in that case, it was certainly timing. In terms of users, I think the model of iTunes listening to an album that you bought, but that's the only album that you can listen to, versus sort of getting like this buffet model of, oh, I can listen to this. I remember when I first opened up Spotify, I probably like binge listened to like really random tracks for about an hour or so.
Mostly Madonna, right?
Mostly Madonna, greatest hits. That's not going to leave me.
Well, wait, no. What's your favorite song?
Mine? Oh man, I love the. It's called "Wagon Wheel" by Old Crow Medicine Show. Probably one of my favorites. I don't know, little known. Actually, I have a thought on Spotify, and you kind of asked on timing. One of the things that I think is interesting, and Uber has the same thing, and I think actually so does Twitter. It's sort of when is the market and the technology in such a place where these things can actually work right. And I think one of the things that's interesting for Spotify was sort of like iTunes was the big player for a long time, and iTunes was this old sort of download model because phones didn't have the bandwidth, you didn't have a persistent internet connection, you didn't have high speed data transfer where you could actually were technically able to stream music. And so I think like I actually used Rhapsody too, and it was just always sort of a pain whenever you were away from your house, you really couldn't listen to music.
Right.
And now that's no longer true with things like LTE and like fiber and Comcast sort of continually bumping up their rates every day and local sync and things like that. So it's kind of interesting. And similarly with Uber and Twitter, it's like really the advent, like without a mobile phone and like fairly accurate kind of GPS location, these experiences wouldn't be possible. So.
Right, especially with Twitter. I remember Twitter initially starting off as a text communication tool.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And
That's
I
where
remember
the 140 comes from, is the SMS. It's 160 in SMS, so it's 20 characters for the handle, and then 140 for the message.
Yeah, I remember first using it and not really getting it until like the visual interface came out, and I was like, okay, that's what it is.
I think one thing to add to timing, my guess for Spotify, what's so interesting about the example there, because getting that license to the catalog is an extraordinarily hard thing. Like that is the most difficult thing, and why music, I think, has struggled with innovation is because without the legal right to play that music, you had Napsters, which were disruptive but didn't sustain, it didn't last. And so not only was it the timing, but also I think starting in Sweden, where the market was in such a destroyed mode, like it had gone off the cliff more than it had in the US or the UK or other markets, you had a desperate industry that knew it, like had to face, the evolution. And so starting with a small prototype, it's kind of like a prototype saying, okay, let's take a market where they have to start to change. We'll get the license in that market. We'll prove out these changes in sales, in viewership. We'll start to put a business model out there that shows revenue share that might be meaningful. And then we'll take that to the juggernauts like the US or other markets that might be big. Like that proof of concept is so critical. And I think that was an incredibly powerful part of how Spotify got going.
Right. I think, yeah, honestly, and I think that's the main reason why Rhapsody probably didn't take off is because it didn't show that much success in the US when it first started. On the other hand, just the data that they had from Stockholm and Sweden and turning around that music industry was probably a big seller for the music labels to turn around in the US as well.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're basically saying you need partners, but you also need to show traction. But if you're a V1, how do you do that? Any advice from?
Well, you have to be a great storyteller. So ideally where you want to get is to say, I promised you X, I'm going to build your audience, I'm going to help you drive your revenues, I'm going to do whatever it is, and you promise it, and we're going to find a way to track it, we're going to measure it. So that was like step 3 for us was we came up with metrics specific to the media industry, like the Nielsen Twitter TV metric or the Billboard Twitter real-time charts to show that Twitter activity was driving ratings or had its own measure of attention. But up until that point, because that took a long time, you've just got to go in. I think it's all about great evangelism and just going in and telling a very logical story from their point of view. Like I only hired people on my team from traditional media. It was extraordinarily hard to staff that team because there's so few people who understood technology innovation, could work in a startup with all of its lack of structure, and then also had produced television, were journalists, or had lived in the music industry in a meaningful way. But so you got to tell that story with authenticity, which so come from that world or study and know that world really well. Have experienced the pain. I was a TV producer before. I'd done interactive TV at Current TV. I had worked in news. I'd worked in publishing. I'd been working in publishing and waiting for the ebook to come along and then got bored with how long it was taking and so left. And so it's like, I had a background. They're like, okay, you're one of us. I could tell stories from the trenches. I understood the technical challenges of what we were asking them to do, that this was not easy. It wasn't like, yeah, so then you just put a hashtag on air. Like, no, that's a whole process, and people get fired for messing that stuff up every day in television. So you go in with a really authentic story. You try as much as you can to speak from their position. And then, just like any good salesperson, you're like, take the jump with me. I'm in it with you, right? Like, I'm not going to let you fall. If you fail, I fail. And then give them some sort of incentive that gives them disproportionate reward. So one of the things we did at Twitter in the early days, it was powerful, and this was just the luck of how that company was growing. We were PR catnip to anyone and everything. Like, you just said Twitter, and you were going to get like 1 million hits. So the downside of that before we had a PR team was we'd get our asses kicked in the media all the time for things we weren't even doing. Once we had a PR team, we could then turn that fire hose to really pour great attention on our partners. So we were doing something with MTV with the VMA Awards. Part of that deal was this story of how you innovated around the VMA Awards. This is going to be your story. We'll bring in the press, because they all pick up our phone calls, they'll listen to our pitches, but it's not going to be about Twitter. We're going to be the side player. You tell the story, and everything we say is about celebrating what you innovated, how you took this risk, how you did something different from your competitors, and the growth you saw from that. So that became a really simple form of currency to barter and trade, and it was part of the philosophy of the company that Twitter isn't the one in the spotlight. We're the platform. We're the vehicle for our users, for our creators, we're a creative canvas for others. So that was actually an incredible power to use in the beginning before we could back it up with data or with monetization.
And as you think about it, all of you guys are platforms. You're a platform for music labels, for drivers, and for journalists. Sort. Interesting.
I think that's interesting because that sort of leads us to sort of think about, now that Spotify is sort of like this area as a music platform, up until now we've sort of been handling the consumption side of things of like music listeners. But, we're starting to think about like what can we do as possible a platform for artists or like, maybe indie artists or like small artists, like what can they do with our platform to actually get them to a better place? And so that's thinking about disruption from like another market that could be possible for our platform.
Nice. So I'm not sure. I have no idea time here, but we'll do a thought exercise maybe for the last question. Thinking about if you were in Harvard's position, what would you do? So basically, right now they have a lot of people paying still a lot of money to go to their university, and yet they have the Coursera's and the Skillshares of the world that are kind of nipping at their ankles. So we have kind of a sustaining innovation versus all these people that want in. What should they do?
So I think MIT is doing something that's kind of along those lines. They have this program called edX, and they do some sort of minor, semi-realistic certification by taking some of their classes. That could be a route that Harvard might be willing to take, maybe for some monetary fee. It's sort of like, Harvard X or something like that. You get this minor certificate that is actually validated in some way. And offer online courses just like a lot of the MMOCs do. MOOCs do.
Interesting. So the risk there, right? If that's a partnership model, then maybe that edX will come in and take over, but Harvard still has a few days left.
I think if I was to think about what's the biggest risk to Harvard as a way to kind of frame a potential solution, it's basically something along the lines of someone is going to come with a blue sky idea about what education should be that no one has ever thought of before, and that's the thing that ultimately disrupts Harvard. And so if I was Harvard, I would probably try to essentially recreate that situation inside of Harvard, but probably outside the actual walls of Harvard. This is like Clay's model, I guess, where I would probably carve off a building somewhere away from campus, put 10 or 15 smart people in the room, and have them attempt to reimagine, what online learning could be with sort of a blue sky approach. And maybe there are some opportunities for sort of crosstalk and collaboration between sort of the more traditional business school curriculum and something new and online. But I think if you end up doing it kind of half-assed and you try to take what they have currently and shoehorn it into some online situation, it's never going to be half as good as someone who was able to start from scratch and reimagine that thing from the ground up. So I think that would probably be more of my approach. And
If I was going to take the partnership approach, I think I would suggest that they reach out to the other elite universities. And I think actually in the education field, I hope, although I know there's plenty of politics and ego, unlike media or incumbent fields, competition's different, right? You're competing for students and for talent, but ultimately you're nonprofits and you have a higher mission you're going for. So I would hope, even though I know it would be very hard, they could think about, all right, well, maybe we redefine the market instead of Stanford versus Harvard or the Ivies versus the next 20 schools. Maybe we create and really identify this elite form of education, band together, make sure we have the technology to make that really effective, and then make sure we really define ourselves versus everyone else, right? So they're going for massive scale and mid-level quality, effectiveness, efficiency, mid-level skills. We're going to really make sure that together we define and brand what elite education is and define that as very different from everything else and make sure we have the technology in place to scale that as effectively as possible. It's always hard. I mean, that's like the Hulu model, right? And that didn't, it's working, but it's not working that well. But that's also because those organizations just are inherently can't see past the competition that they've been around for 100 years. They can't quite work past that, and they don't have the economic incentives. But I hope in a university there might be a call to be able to see past those issues.
Awesome. Questions? Yeah? Questions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the question was, what Twitter has grown to become, the founders never articulated in the beginning, and it wasn't part of their vision. They had a curiosity about public messaging, but nobody foresaw all the future uses. And how does that affect? Like, how is that a part of the story of Twitter? That is a huge and fascinating. It's one of the most fascinating parts of Twitter. And to this day, it's its greatest strength and challenge that Twitter as a company is revealing itself and being shaped rather than being one specific vision and a specific purpose that was then just built out and extended. And the early leadership was extraordinarily good, and this is so unusual for an executive team, at letting users shape it. Like, that is just, especially something that ended up being such a media tool, like that is just doesn't happen in media. Like, you come in with your incredible script, or you have a vision, it's that force of will, and it's a very collaborative force, but it's a certain set of people of control to create stories. So it was, for me as a media executive coming into that environment, incredibly thrilling and fascinating to watch to watch the company say, okay, let's put some features out there and see what happens, and then iterate and learn from that. And they made some decisions that were fundamentally important to that being able to happen. So being public was the most important. That allowed people to obviously see one another's content, but with the open API, it meant that Twitter became this vat of data and information that everyone became curious about. So it wasn't just about publishing, but it was about understanding what people thought, what was happening in the world. The asymmetrical follow model just liberated social norms and allowed people to do things they hadn't done before. Of course, we talked already about the short format, just took the stress level down and the accessibility up. So there was about 3 or 4 product decisions made early on, not all in one setting. They were like over periods of time, and the follow model would come up, and Jason, the head of product at the time, was the one pushing for the asymmetry. And that was a bit of luck and a bit of brilliance, and also a bit of saying, okay, we have an initial idea, and it's interesting to us. We can see there's something here, the delightfulness of just getting information from a set of people serendipitously throughout the day can actually change what you choose to do. Things like, oh, there's this interesting festival going on, or so-and-so's having dinner across the street, maybe I'll go say hi. So super small scale things that they then let, by being open, radically open, they allowed the users to then shape and change it. And it was amazing. And the biggest challenge is, how do you shift from letting a product reveal itself? And it's kind of unique. I don't think there are too many companies that follow this pattern. Although maybe as an idea, this is like when people think about how they allow their ideas to come, this is actually probably part of the process. It's almost like Twitter, the pre-process of the product was part of the public story, rather than like, the launch, kind of think of Twitter actually launching 3 or 4 years ago. But that's also been one of its fundamental challenges, which I think is a universal challenge, is when do you then bring in more control? When do you decide what it should be for and build towards that, rather than build towards everything it could be, which is an incredibly distracting, challenging, and almost impossible task. And I think, to this day, it's something they're working on.
Yep.
Originally, I guess that most of the disruptive ideas that the company had came from the founders or very early product managers. Today, with the size that the companies have, my guess is that some of these disruptive ideas should come from specific groups of the company. So the question is for all of you today, based on your experience, from which roles or groups in the companies come those disruptive ideas that you think are going to shape the future of the company?
So for those in the back, this is from what roles do disruptive ideas come from within the company now?
I can take a first stab. So at Uber, it's actually an interesting structure in that it's a pretty decentralized company. And so every single city has its own office. So we have close to 260 offices around the world. Some of them are only a few people. But so each city is operated almost like its own little mini company, where the general manager of that city is actually in a certain way like the CEO. And they're incredibly empowered, and they're on the line for the performance of that city. And so they're actually oftentimes the ones coming up with a lot of the sort of marketing ideas and sort of special programs, sort of like ice cream trucks or kittens or special like disaster response sort of initiatives if a particular market is experiencing something like that. Inside of the actual company where we're doing product development, we're divided into, each team has a particular area of responsibility, and that team really has a large amount of autonomy and control over their roadmap and their ideas and their feature set. And so like the team that I'm working on presently is called Uber for Business. And so we're actually working specifically on how does Uber enter into the business sector. and sort of what are our product offerings there. And that was an idea that was surfaced by, I think it was originally, actually came from Travis, our CEO, and then put together a small team of 3 or 4 people, and now it's a team of almost 20. And there's several other kind of very similar, so like Uber Rush, which is a courier service in New York City, as well as Uber Fresh, which is a food delivery service that we're piloting in LA. And so a lot of these things are kind of they're little mini sort of teams. I like to think of them as like little startups inside of what really no longer is a startup. It's a 2,000-person company. And I think that's one of the ways. And those ideas come from the top down, but they also come from the bottom up, where they can come out of a hackathon or an event where someone just had an idea, and there's this sort of like top down and simultaneous sort of bottom up approach with inside of the company.
So at Spotify, it's actually very similar. We're also broken up into little teams that work like little startups within the company. And the teams would usually be consisted of like a product owner, a tech lead, developers, and a designer. And what they do is we work in little teams. So like the radio team would be its own team, like the social team would be its own team. And they always try to think of something new that relates to their feature. And that happens in multiple ways. So that can happen whether it aligns with our current roadmap, or whether it's something that's prototyped up from like a hack week that we have. And these ideas really come from anywhere. And once we present these ideas, everyone really listens and sort of considers it as can this be something that's part of our roadmap? And if it sort of gets a nod from within the team itself, they'll start to build it out. And so it can happen in all ways.
I think organizational design is overlooked and is a critical compartment as you grow as to where you get these great ideas from. And obviously product has to be at the core of it, but that's not sufficient. Like understanding who your market is and who you're serving, and then having autonomous teams that are 100% responsible for and have the data around and the ability to actually influence the product around those marketplaces, those teams, those users, however you want to define it. City in the case of Uber makes a lot of sense. That identifying what that unit needs to be that will release the most important ideas. That is the single most important thing, and it's actually extraordinarily hard because as your company evolves, as the marketplace evolves, the structure you had in place originally, especially when you're a scrappy startup, changes. And being able to really define your value, absolutely know this is what we do uniquely, this is what differentiates us from our competitors, this is where the value is, and building around that. That means you have to really know who you are as a company and really understand your product today and for 5 to 10 years in the future. And I think that's the best way. If you can answer that question, then design the organization around it. That's the best way to solve it.
Last question. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
So for Spotify, because each team is sort of very autonomous, we also have an autonomy of tools, and I think that's been proven very useful. So for example, one team would be using Slack, another team would be using HipChat, or another team would be using Basecamp. And just as long as they're finding their successes, we'd pretty much allow any tool to be used. But what was really beneficial is that we have agile coaches that work with multiple teams, and what they do is, hey, this team has actually used this tool for 6 months, and it's been proven that it's really working for them. Would the other teams be willing to use it to increase your productivity or develop faster or anything like that? And I think those kind of allowing us to pick and choose our own tools has really benefit in a lot of ways.
I think the biggest thing from my perspective that I've seen work well at Uber, and to an extent at Airbnb as well when I was there, is sort of where people sit and how you actually are like kind of structured in your day-to-day seating. What's the sort of default? And so the default in both of these companies I've worked at has always been you're around your specific program or your product team. So I sit with the Uber for Business team. We have 2 other designers, 10 engineers, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm a designer. My functional role is that of design. And so I actually talk across the company with all of the other designers. Likewise do the engineers and the product managers. So this kind of like cross-section where I'm constantly focused on Uber for Business and like the projects that I'm working on specifically, but I'm able to talk across the company and share ideas and see, maybe someone else is working on something for Uber Rush, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like, let's bring that back. Let's like have a bigger meeting around that, and then maybe. Oh, absolutely, yeah, multiple times per week, and there's also a lot of meetings that happen on an ad hoc basis where for some particular need surfaces, and so that's kind of pretty consistent, I think. I've seen this work well in a lot of medium-sized technology companies. This sort of format. I think Facebook is very similar.
Yeah, we had cross-functional meetings like that on a regular basis around key markets. But I'll answer the question in a slightly different way. One of the interesting roles I didn't realize that Twitter was going to have with our partners was essentially as a communication vehicle within that company. So NBC Universal or HBO, you name it, any number of these media companies, we ended up actually sharing information about the company across teams that weren't able to communicate within the structure itself. And my team used to groan about it because it was an added burden of information flow and catching people up on meetings they hadn't been in with their own colleagues. I was like, you know what? The org design is not set up for this level of work of what we're doing. And so yes, we have to take that burden on, and that's how you make yourself indispensable, is when you help actually become a vehicle for information flow and keeping those different teams together, even as an outsider. And if you don't do it, who's going to get mad? They're going to get mad at you because you're like, well, why didn't you tell me this thing was happening? I thought, like, aren't I your main ally within the organization? Like, who are you loyal to? So it was more work, but it was really interesting to know that maybe the lesson here is sometimes external forces can actually be that that sort of almost vertebra helping connect your company in new ways until you figure out what that new structure is, or at least pay attention to where people are getting that information from or finding interesting connections from, because that might reveal to you a structure that wasn't obvious.
I think that's it for questions.
Yes.
I have no idea what we're doing next.
We're good. Thank you very much. Yes.